from Mitchell Hall at the University of Delaware. This is Delaware Debates.
Good evening. I'm Nancy Karabjanian, and on behalf of Delaware Public Media and the University of Delaware Center for Political Communication, I'd like to welcome you to Delaware Debates 2016. These debates are made possible with the financial support from AARP Delaware and additional support from the American Cancer Society, Cancer Action Network, and the William P. Frank Foundation of Delaware. Joining me to co-moderate this debate is Dr. Lindsay Hoffman, Associate Director of the Center for Political Communication at the University of Delaware, and James Dawson, Political Reporter for Delaware Public Media. Our first debate this evening is between the candidates for Delaware Governor. It includes Democrat John Carney and Republican Colin Bonini. Gentlemen, welcome to Delaware Debates 2016.
Thanks.
Great to be with you.
Tonight's debate will be divided into two parts, as you know, and for our audience as well. Following a 1-minute opening statement from each of you, Lindsay Hoffman and James Dawson will pose questions to the candidates. Responses in this section will be limited to 1 minute and 30 seconds, with a 1-minute rebuttal and the opportunity afterwards for follow-up discussion. The second part of our debate will include questions posed by students from the University of Delaware and Delaware State University. This year as well, we are also taking online questions from members of the public. Responses in this portion are limited to 1 minute. Each candidate will also have 1 minute for a closing statement. Our live audience here at Mitchell Hall on the University of Delaware Newark campus understands that there will be no applause during tonight's debate. We did hold a coin toss earlier to determine the order for this evening, and with that result, we will begin with Colin Bonini, who has the first opening statement. 1 minute.
Fantastic. I don't know if the crowd knows, but we get very strict instructions before this debate, and I noticed in one of the instructions it said that free hairstyling and makeup were available. So I'm actually only here for the free makeover. So I do appreciate that. I think the choice in this election is very, very clear. We can do more of the same, or we can change course. And I would argue very vociferously that Delaware must change course. I think whether you look at our economy, our public schools, crime in our neighborhoods, especially in Wilmington, but also downstate, I think Delaware is facing extraordinary challenges. And my contention is that simply doing more of the same, voting for more of the same, you're going to get more of the same. So I think the choice tonight is very, very clear. You can vote for more of the same. By the way, we have a really good candidate here, good guy, or I'm kindly asking you to please support pretty strong change and kindly asking you to support me, Colin Bonini, for governor. Thank you very, very much.
Mr. Carney, your opening statement.
Thank you and good evening. For a lot of us, Delaware is a great place to live and work and raise our families. But for too many of our neighbors, the opportunities are just too few. When I grew up in Claymont, most of my neighbors worked at DuPont or in the industrial facilities along the Delaware River. They were good jobs. They lasted a lifetime, but there's so few out there today. And so the first priority for the next governor has to be creating jobs for working families. And you can't talk about the strength of our state without talking about the strength of our largest city. But the violence in Wilmington is terrorizing families and making it difficult to have a positive business climate downtown. Part of the solution has to be in our schools. For too long, we've jumped from one reform to the other. For me, the most important thing we can do today to improve our schools is pick a strategy and stick to it. I'm running for governor because our state needs somebody with the vision and courage to lead our state in a very uncertain future. Thank you for coming tonight.
We will now get started with the questions, and we will begin with Dr. Lindsay Hoffman. Her first question will be posed to Mr. Bonini.
Hi, Mr. Bonini. Wilmington has been referred to as Murder Town, USA. Since 2011, 765 people have been shot, and 132 of them have died from gun violence. What will you do as governor to reduce the number of deaths and injuries from such gun violence?
Whatever is necessary. And I think if there has been a greater failure in our political class, and by the way, this is not a party thing, than the violence in Wilmington, I'd like to know what it is. And I think we need a governor and, quite frankly, a General Assembly and leadership up and down the state and in the city of Wilmington who's going to say this is unacceptable. And that means if we have to combine police forces, you do it. If that means we have to bring in the state police, you do it. If that means you have to build substations in those high-risk communities, you do it. The bottom line here is, I think the first thing that's got to change is we need the courage in the governor's office and other places to say that this is unacceptable. And I think greater enforcement is the answer. And I got to tell you, whatever that solution is, like I said, combining police forces, bringing the state police in, we need greater enforcement, more police in those neighborhoods, integrated into the community so the violence will stop. Because Wilmington can't make progress until people feel safe. And I think it's actually one of the greatest failures of our political culture here in Delaware, and I think we need an elected governor who's going to say this is going to stop no matter what I have to do.
Mr. Carney, you have 1 minute for a rebuttal.
This is a big problem, and it's got to be a top priority for the next governor. We need a different approach to law enforcement in the community. I've lived in the city of Wilmington for 30 years. I've been in these neighborhoods. I've coached these kids. We need to do a better job with law enforcement, a different approach, more of a community-based approach where law enforcement and police are working with members of the community. And we have to, importantly, address the root causes of these problems. And that's academic failure earlier on in school. We have to make sure that the kids in Wilmington get a much better education than they are today. It's been a problem that has gone back generations. Now's the time we need a governor to work with the legislatures, all the school districts involved, to put in place an educational plan for our city so that every child coming up in neighborhoods in the city of Wilmington gets a good education and an opportunity to participate in an increasingly difficult and more competitive economy like that we have today.
We are now moving into our follow-up conversation. So at this point, though, and I don't want to cut you off, but I have to for time.
Quickly,
I thought I saw 15 seconds.
Yeah,
though,
Nancy, there is a slight disconnect between that and the...
Well, 15 seconds will move to stop. So the 15 seconds will remain. Once you see 15 seconds, you have 15 seconds, and then it will say stop. But we do have time now for follow-up conversation, and I want to encourage you to have as much of a conversation between you as candidates on this issue, and we will be here to prompt that conversation. I'll turn it back to Lindsay Hoffman.
Thank you.
So we've talked a lot about Wilmington so far, but a report from the Dover Police Department this year showed that serious crimes like robbery, burglary, assault, and weapons law violations are on the rise in the city. What will you do to combat crime beyond Wilmington in places like Dover and in western Sussex County?
Let's let Mr. Carney continue then with his thought, and we'll come back to you, Mr. Bonini.
Well, that's exactly right. And the problems in those communities are serious as well. Smaller scale, smaller communities, maybe easier to address. In the case of Dover, just like Wilmington, you're talking about local police and law enforcement that have that as their primary responsibility. Western Sussex County, you're talking about Delaware State Police. The Delaware State Police officials report to the governor, and they have to provide the leadership up and down our state to move more towards, as I said earlier, more a community-based approach to policing, where law enforcement is seen as somebody coming in to a neighborhood not to occupy it, not to approach everybody as if they're a criminal, but to work with the community to address the crime problems, the unique crime problems in each of those small towns and in western Sussex County.
I would like to give you a chance to jump in here.
The crime in Dover is very close to my heart. My alma mater, Wesley College, which actually brought me to Delaware. So, John, you can blame Wesley. There's a shooting within 2 or 3 blocks of my alma mater, and it seems like every month now. And the bottom line is we need more police. And I agree with John. Those police need to be integrated directly into the community. We need more enforcement. And I realize that may not be the politically correct thing to say in this sort of national discussion we're having, but the truth is, you can't better yourself. You can't better the life of your family until you feel safe in your communities. And in terms of the rural areas in Sussex, the bottom line is in Kent and Sussex counties, we need more state troopers. They've been understaffed for years. And the truth that you dial 911, if you're in Milford Neck in Lower Kent County, it might be 45 minutes before you see a trooper. And we need to, I think that's a very strong state responsibility, and I think the governor has a responsibility to provide the resources to law enforcement. And then real quickly, again, I think John's right on the right track here. Prosperity solves so many of these problems. When people are working, and they feel safe, and their families are going to have, are going to be safe in their economic environments, are getting up and going to good jobs, that solves a lot of the crime problems. That solves a lot of the drug problems. So I think prosperity policies that drive our economy are going to help solve a lot of these issues.
We're going to revisit this issue, hopefully, moving forward, but we do want to stay on track with our topics, and we're going to move on to another topic. I don't know if even an hour would be enough to discuss Wilmington. We're going to jobs and the economy, and James Dawson will be posing this question to Mr. Carney.
Mr. Carney, big corporations like DuPont and AstraZeneca continue to pull jobs from Delaware, and even Sev1, which was held up as a model for small startups here, moved its headquarters to Boston and made big layoffs recently. Is it worth giving out millions of dollars in tax breaks to these companies, or should the state focus more on local businesses?
This is the top priority for the next governor, and the legislature working with the governor is to help with the transition of Delaware's economy from more of an industrial age, like some of the jobs I referred to at the outset along the Delaware River, which are still important, into more of an innovation economy. And the University of Delaware actually has to be right at the forefront in developing some of those venues here at the Star campus. We just cut a ribbon earlier this week on an innovation center there. So it's true that the fact that we can rely on DuPont is long gone. When I was a kid, I think DuPont probably had 30 or 35,000 employees in our state. When the announcement was made back in December that DuPont and Dow were going to merge, they were down to 6,600. Right after that announcement, they announced the releasing of 1,700. So we're down, we're less than 5,000. We were very successful in getting the headquarters of the three companies, two of the three companies they're going to spin out, headquartered here. But the economy for the future is going to be more about small businesses, innovation, and that is about creating a climate where businesses can be successful and thrive. The government doesn't create jobs. They create a climate where businesses can be successful. They fund infrastructure so that businesses can get their products to market. They provide, like the university and Delaware State University, the talent that businesses need. Increasingly, it's about talent and workforce in terms of where the jobs are going to go.
You have a 1-minute rebuttal.
Yeah, Delaware's not a place people are bringing their businesses. And there's a reason. In 2012, I believe, the Delaware Economic Development Office asked CEOs and business leaders, why aren't you bringing your jobs to Delaware? And they had very clear answers. They said, you're not a right-to-work state, your government's too big, too expensive, too intrusive, your public schools aren't good enough, and your utility rates are too high. We know exactly, James, what to do to bring jobs to Delaware, and the state government and a strong governor can help fix all of those problems. And I realize that, I think John, first of all, is absolutely right. The economy is changing. We are looking at more of an entrepreneurial style, but I'm not giving up on those manufacturing jobs. I think the reality is, if the state government would create an environment where those business folks want to come, want to grow their jobs, taking those 4 issues specifically, I think we can do it. I'm actually very excited if we get some strong leadership in our government that we're going to be able to create an environment where businesses will come here. It's not happening now. It's not happening now.
Well, let's get into follow-up conversation, and I want to pull in something that relates to what you said in your opening statement. There was the opinion piece that was written by former Governor Mike Castle in this past Sunday's News Journal and GOP candidate Meredith Chapman. It put the blame for the stale economy on those currently in office. And that goes to both of you because you both have been in office for a long time. He says new blood is needed, fresh thinking to revive the stale economy. While he may be advocating for more Republicans to emerge in leadership, what should voters think either of you would do to bring change instead of more of the same? I'm going to let Mr. Carney answer this first, and then you two can discuss from there.
Yeah, I've been very clear about what I do, and I've released a plan to improve our public education system, which starts with quality early education for all the kids, particularly kids from disadvantaged backgrounds in our state. It includes getting resources into classrooms so teachers have the resources they need and students have what they need to be successful. It focuses on making sure that every student is career or college ready at graduation and actually graduates from school and puts a premium on higher education as part of that. Same thing with jobs in the economy. We have an extensive plan. I would recommend to the people in the audience and those listening to us and watching us maybe on TV at johncarney.org to look at our plan for growing the economy. You have to fight on you have to compete every day. You're telling me to stop. I don't see any.
This is the moderated discussion, and you can converse with each other as much with us, so please interject.
Please, I don't want to interrupt John.
No, go ahead. I thought there was a clock, and I'm looking for a clock.
No, because I was like, he's saying good
By
things.
the way, to the point about right to work, and all the employers that have come to us and talked about setting up a facility in here, I've never heard the issue of, well, you're not a right to work state, so we're going to South Carolina or somebody else. So I don't know whether that's the solution. Clearly,
Well, let me let Mr.
workforce
Bonini
is the
address that.
solution. Sure.
So it's because those companies are in South Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee. And I had gotten into a very interesting conversation with a very strong advocate for labor unions. Let's just say it that way. He was screaming at me at the Harrington Fair about right to work. Tried to physically intimidate me, which is kind of funny because I'm a big guy. But I finally we didn't agree on this, and I finally kept asking him, what's the average wage of an auto worker in Delaware? And he said, well, let me tell you, auto workers make less money in right to work states than they do in non-right to work states. And I said, what is the average wage of an auto worker in Delaware? It's 0, because there aren't any. And the bottom line is that right to work, and it doesn't have to be statewide. We can negotiate what this looks like. It can be enterprise zones is the program I'm talking about. But right to work is one component of it. But I think the entire environment, and your initial point was who's to blame, and you're right, it's all of us. And I'm not going to say, oh, it happens to be the Democrats who are in charge now. The Republicans controlled half the General Assembly for a while too. It's all of us. And I don't think it was, there's some evil plan, but we have created an environment. Their businesses do not feel welcome in Delaware. And we have to work together, quite frankly, to change that perception. And I think, quite frankly, having a conservative-leaning governor who is unashamedly pro-business, I think would go a long way toward that.
Let's move on. I know that there's more. I know we could talk more about this as well.
John was rolling and I was rolling.
We do have other topics, and this one I think is quite important to every person in the state of Delaware. So we're moving on to the issue of education. James Dawson will be posing this question first to you, Mr. Bonini.
Thanks, James.
Mr. Bonini, school funding remains a front burner issue in the states, with some including the Wilmington Education Improvement Commission advocating a weighted funding formula for high poverty schools. Do you believe that a comprehensive look at school funding is needed? Why or why not?
So the answer is yes, absolutely we do. And my bottom line is that every dollar in our public education system should follow the students, wherever that student is. And do we need more resources in the higher priority schools? Absolutely. It may surprise you. As you know, I'm a strong fiscal conservative, but absolutely. So I think that a significant problem to real education reform is our sort of Byzantine funding system. If you graduated from the University of Delaware and you have a degree in nuclear science, you probably still can't figure out what our public education funding system is. It's extraordinarily difficult and complex, and quite frankly, the money frequently doesn't get down to the classroom where I think everybody believes it belongs. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. I think we need to fundamentally changing our public education funding system, and the bottom line is the money should follow that student down into the classroom.
Mr. Carney, you have a 1-minute rebuttal.
In Delaware, we don't have an underfunded education system. Could we use additional resources in classrooms with a high percentage of disadvantaged students? We could. And we ought to look at mechanisms to do that, and they ought to be mechanisms that are flexible depending on who the principal is in that school, the particular needs of that student population. I went and talked to the principal, Dr. Brown, at Booker T. Washington Elementary School outside of Dover, and I asked him if he was given additional state dollars or additional educational dollars, and he got some from Race to the Top, what would he do with it? And he said he would put in place an extended day program, and they did that, and they were able to move their kids along. And I asked Dr. Brown up at Eastside Charter what he would do with the next state dollar, and he said that he would hire social psychologists because he had so many kids that came to his classroom with problems and trauma. So all the different schools have different needs, and we ought to have some flexibility in a system that, frankly, is fairly well funded.
I would invite Mr. Bonini to participate in this conversation unless our panelists have a follow-up that they would like to ask.
First of all, John's absolutely right. And, we are not underfunded. We are fifth, sixth most.
In the top 10.
Top 10.
And most of it comes from the state.
Yeah, so it's not a resource issue. But I do think that the key here is getting those resources down to the classroom. And what I tell people is that who should be responsible for school reform? And I say it's parents, teachers, and principals, by the way, in that order. They're the ones who have, and I think John just gave two really good examples, know exactly what the true issues the students are facing. And if we can get those resources out of all the well-intentioned programs and bureaucracies we've created here in Delaware and get them directly into the classroom in the hands of the principals, teachers, and parents, I think you're going to start seeing tremendous progress.
Moving beyond K through 8, though, what if to both of you, what is your position on state funding for higher education that goes beyond money for workforce development?
Got to cut the University of Delaware. Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me let Mr. Carney answer that first.
Well, somebody asked me the other day, and I've been working as a member of Congress on behalf of the people of Delaware to address college affordability, and we know we've seen the cost of higher education going up on almost an annual basis. One of the best ways to keep college tuition for Delaware students as low as possible is to make sure that the legislature and the governor put money in the budget to support those institutions, the University of Delaware, Delaware State University, and Delaware Technical and Community College, because those institutions are going to be the drivers of the economy of the future. We talked about the Star Campus. We talked about the incubator that's going in down there. A lot of really good things happening at Delaware State University. It can be an economic driver in central Delaware and should be. Well, the only way that they can do that if they're well-resourced and that and the university, of course, has quite a bit of capacity to attract private dollars and donors from donors and private individuals, which Delaware State doesn't quite have. But we need to make sure that we follow through on our commitment to higher ed when we know that the economy in the years 5 years from now and beyond is going to be dependent as much on the success of our institutions of higher education.
If you have about a 10-second response to that, you can.
So my campaign manager is going to hate it when I say this, but John's dead on right. and I would actually include our private eds as well. Obviously, I'm very biased towards Wesley, but Goldie Beacon, Wilmington University. I mean, I think we can be very proud of our higher education culture here in Delaware, and I absolutely think they're part of the solution for the economic problems. Real quickly, the cost of college has got to be addressed. I was actually listening when John made a speech the other day, and please, John, if I'm misquoting, tell me, but when you went to Dartmouth, it was $6,500, and now it's $65,000. And despite his gray, he's not that old a guy.
Well, before we all faint from the inflation here, let's move on to our next topic. We're moving on to the environment and energy at this point. Lindsay Hoffman will be posing this question to John Carney.
A question.
It's coming.
I had the opposite one.
Well, let's just.
I'll start there. Thank you. So, Mr.
Pick
Carney.
an easier one.
Yeah. This is too easy. I want it.
All right. Now,
There is an essay to follow.
I'll start with Mr. Carney. You've said that one of the most serious threats facing our state is climate change and sea level rise. What initiatives would you introduce to reduce these threats?
Yeah, this is a tough issue, right? Because to affect climate change at large, that you need really national and international policy. And that's frankly where the Congress has failed to come together behind a plan within the administration to address some of this issue nationally and, as I said, internationally. Now, we just have had some recent agreements internationally which bode well for the reduction of some of these gases. But for us, the focus has to be on coastal resiliency. And we can argue to the cows come home about what's causing global warming, but the rising seas are indisputable. And we are a low-lying state. So we should put most of our energy and resources, in my view, and some of this is already going on, into hardening and into coastal resiliency project. We've had a big project at Prime Hook, where what was a freshwater wetlands was being overrun by saltwater because of the incursions through the dunes, and that was partly a result of storms and partly the result of the rising sea levels. That's where we ought to put our resources.
Mr. Bonini, your follow-up?
Yeah, so regardless of what one thinks about global warming, and I think the reality is we face dramatic challenges along our coastline. One of the things is the state government has to get its act together. And the example I give is I have a community in my district that Department of Natural Resources 20 years ago said was going to be underwater. First of all, it's not underwater. And secondly, they approved a sewer line out to it. So talk about the mixed messages of, hey, we've got to pull back, we've got to stop development, we've got to, we have to be tremendously concerned about these rising sea levels, but oh, by the way, we're going to encourage development by running a sewer line out there. So I think that the state government needs to be much more clear on exactly what's going on. And the bottom line is, for those folks who live, quite a few in my district actually, that beach replenishment and coastal reclamation is vitally important. It's where people live, and I do agree that the resources we have should be focused on those areas. And I think sort of spending money on these great umbrella issues in Delaware when we have real local needs doesn't make any sense to me.
Let's move into discussion.
Sure.
So, Mr. Bonini, where do you stand on man-made climate change, and how do you plan to adapt to it as governor?
So does the climate change? Absolutely. Is there lots of proof one way or the other? I think the jury is still mostly out on how that's happening. But regardless of what one thinks about that particular issue, we definitely have an issue here in Delaware. And regardless of how it happened, and others can argue about it, I happen to think man-made has a significant component to it. But regardless of how we got there, the Gulf Stream is lower than it used to be. And it's pushing sea rise on Delaware's coast. It just is. There's no question about it. We can have an argument like till the cows come home about why that is. But the bottom line is that, to me, means the resources that we have in state government need to be focused on those communities. And again, if you look at the Department of Natural Resources, DelDOT, all these other places, there's lots of well-intentioned programs, but the bottom line is the resources we can generate need to get into those programs that are rebuilding the beaches, that are building the barriers that stop erosion, that stop the seawater drainage into the freshwater areas. It happens all the time in my district. And the bottom line is the state government's role is to fund that infrastructure.
I want to remind you this is the follow-up discussion portion, and I think James Dawson would actually like to throw a new issue out there.
That's right. This could go for Mr. Carney. You mentioned this a little bit earlier, but with agriculture being Delaware's largest industry, what do you see as the state's role in helping farmers cope with saltwater intrusion, rising temperatures, more rain, and the new pest and mold problems that come with those conditions?
So again, we've had a bite out of this apple in a big way around Prime Hook, because if you look inland of what used to be the freshwater bays there, you have the contamination of farmland with saltwater incursion, as you said. So we've got to, in some places, just face the music, and I think that's what the Fish and Wildlife Plan for that area really contemplates, where they've reestablished the dune, and they're going to let nature take its place. They haven't hardened that dune, and certainly after storm, that's going to be completely a freshwater or a saltwater bay there, or part of the Delaware Bay. And the farmers and landowners that are around that area, we have to look at using maybe ag land preservation fund.
I'm interrupting again, I
can't
know.
see any timer here. That's what's confusing me. If I had a timer to tell me how much time I have left.
You have me.
Nancy's your timer.
You have me.
You're a very nice timer.
Thank you. We are going to move on to the next topic, and I understand the value of what we are already discussing, but James is going to take us to the issue of revenue spending and balancing the state budget. You will be posing this question to Mr. Bonini.
Recent budget forecasts by the Delaware Economic Financial Advisory Council indicate the state will have significantly less money to spend next year. Secretary of Finance Tom Cook said that it's a wake-up call to the next General Assembly. And if you're elected, what tough choices are you willing to make to balance the budget?
I would argue that's probably one of the best reasons to elect me, because you've been covering the General Assembly, I'm not afraid to make those choices. And I think anybody who's taken more than 5 minutes to look at my record realizes I'm willing to take tough stands. I may be wrong, as my wife says I'm wrong, but I'm consistently wrong. It's good to be consistent. But I take tough stands. The bottom line is that Delaware has a spending problem, not a revenue problem. We bring in just similar to education, as John mentioned, we bring in per capita some of the highest amounts of money in the entire country. We are 5th or 6th in the country every year, sometimes as high as 2nd or 3rd in per capita expenditures. Our problem is spending, not revenue. And I'll tell you, we have got to have an adult conversation about spending. And spending is in the about 70%, give or take, maybe a little bit less, of our operating budget is in 2 areas. It is in state employees and their benefits, and it is in Medicaid. So any adult conversation about budget issues that does not address those 2 things, I quite frankly don't think is being honest. And I've put proposals on both of those issues. I support an early retirement incentive for state employees to reduce the workforce. People say, you really want to reduce the workforce? Yes, I do. I want to do that in a humane way without having to lay anybody off. And I think we need to standardize how Medicaid and state employee health care is tracked and billed, and I think we can save anywhere from 10 to 25%, which quite frankly doesn't sound like a big number. 10 to 25% of a couple $2 billion is real money. So I actually think our solutions on the budget side are almost exclusively on the
Mr. Carney, your 1-minute rebuttal.
Yeah, I would argue that this issue is the best reason for people of our state to vote for me. I've actually worked, when I was Secretary of Finance, 2 balanced budgets. And I understand some of the problems that we have on the spending side and some of the problems that we have on the revenue side. And by the way, it's both a revenue and a spending problem. Colin mentioned healthcare costs. We are self-insured, meaning the state manages the costs of healthcare to state employees and retirees, and that's a big number. And it's been growing at a rate that far exceeds inflation. We've got to manage those costs better. Our Medicaid spending is over $1 billion a year on a $4 billion budget. That's a big number, and it has to be better managed. We also have a revenue problem. We've become reliant, while Colin's been in the Senate, on abandoned property revenue that's going away. It's a $400 to $500 million number, and half of it might not be there next year.
We're into moderated discussion now.
May I follow?
So this is related. I think we can have a discussion. But Mr. Bonini, you haven't voted for a state budget in 22 years. So the first question is why? And if elected, will you sign a budget and bill into law?
So happy to answer the first questions. There's 2 reasons. One is we spend too much money, right? And quite frankly, I proposed a bill in the mid-90s that put caps on spending, and quite frankly, if we had passed that bill and lived by those standards, we'd be running hundreds of $millions of surpluses every year. So A, we just spend too much, and B, I think there's a tremendous lack of transparency in how we do the budget. And by the way, I don't think this is the governor's fault. I think this is the General Assembly's fault, and you can say that's part of me as well. But you know, we basically passed the budget, $4 billion, late in June, usually late at night, with, you know, who knows what's in it, quite frankly. We created an entire bureaucracy for animal control in a budget 2 years ago. Nobody knew it was even in there because the Joint Finance Committee slipped it in.
We are in discussion portion.
But I apologize. So the 2 reasons are it's too expensive, and I think it lacks transparency. Thank you. Sorry.
You can respond to that if you like, or we can move to another topic with James Dawson.
Well, I would just underscore the point that healthcare costs alone are overcoming the budget because they're growing at a rate that's unsustainable, frankly, in that it's a rate greater than revenue growth. And when you're losing revenues, as the state is currently with what I mentioned a minute ago, abandoned property, then you've got a big problem. And the next governor is going to come in on day one and have a $250 to $300 million deficit, and that's going to be hard to deal with. So you need somebody responsible to deal with it.
We're running out of time, so I'm going to table this discussion as well. I seem to do that a lot.
Oh, that's right.
But from the bottom line, let's go on to politics and the personal. Lindsay Hoffman will pose this first question to Mr. Carney.
We've had 8 years of the Markell administration. The state had its last Republican governor in 1993. If elected, how will you differentiate your administration, Mr. Carney, from preceding ones? And where do you take the state from here?
Obviously, I talked a minute ago about my plan for improving public schools here in our state. We've released a plan to grow Delaware's economy and to move the economy from more of an industrial age into an age of innovation. What's interesting, I did this once before, you may remember. Unsuccessfully, I ran for governor 8 years ago. I'm better prepared today than I was 8 years ago to address the economic challenges that the state is facing, the budgetary challenge that the state is facing, the healthcare challenges that the state is facing, and I understand better than ever how competitive that we have to be economically. We have to be playing at the top of our game in our public education, in higher education, in the quality of our infrastructure, roads and water infrastructure, just about at every level, and our workforce has to be second to none. These are very different conditions than they were 8 years ago. And so there are a lot of things that the Markell administration has done and put in place that we will build on, and there will be other things that we will do differently.
Mr. Bonini, you have 1 minute.
So, I mean, I think the bottom line is we've had 24 years of one-party rule in the governor's office, and I think it's going to be very difficult for another Democrat, and I'm not a very partisan guy, as people will tell you who follow me in the General Assembly. I think it's going to be very difficult for any Democrat governor to be able to make the difficult decisions that need to be made, because my argument is obviously, then why weren't they made in the last 24 years, right? So, but I will tell you, I think Delaware has to change course. And I am very upfront in telling people that this is a bright, smart guy, friend of mine, who will be, and my campaign manager hates it when I say this, John, but is absolutely competent to be Delaware's next governor. There's no question about it. But the bottom line is, we have got to change course. And I'm going to hopefully get a chance maybe in closing statements to talk about some of the statistics. And I think the bottom line here, again, like I said in my opening statement, is, do we want more of the same or do we want change? And I think I'm representing a pretty significant change.
We're now into moderated discussion. Go ahead, you may make your point now through this.
I've said, in addressing a number of the issues and questions that you had, how I would do things differently. And the fact of the matter is, it's a very different world. It's a very different economy than it was 8 years ago. It's certainly way different than it was when I was growing up as a kid in Claymont. I see my mom down there in the front row. How you doing, Mom?
Hey, Mom. We like moms.
We got to do things differently. If we're going to educate the kids in the city of Wilmington so that they can participate in our economy, so that they can have the same opportunities of kids that grow up with more means in the suburbs, then we got to do things differently. And I've got a plan, and I think most importantly, the next governor has to be able to work with the legislature, and I see other legislators here in the room as well, to do things differently and to do things that will be effective in educating kids and moving our economy forward.
This is the discussion portion, so you may jump in.
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess but my point is, I think it's going to be very difficult to have an expectation, regardless of how well-intentioned, that we're going to take on the teachers union, take on the trial lawyers, take on the government labor unions. I mean, I think I have a friend who's a former Speaker of the House in Oklahoma. Delaware is all blue. We've gotten there in the last 24 years. Oklahoma is all red. They have some of the very same problems. And the issue here is giving the sort of political freedom of movement to accomplish things. And it means picking fights with people you don't want to pick fights with. And I think we need a sort of a street fighter governor. And I think John is absolutely sincere, but I think it's going to be very difficult to have, you know,
let me let
frankly,
Mr.
another
Carney
Democrat
wants
do
to
that.
add something.
So please, thanks. I'm sorry.
I don't think it's just about picking fights. Look, I've worked in Congress for the last 6 years. I mean, people are picking fights every day.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
With the Republican
scars to show
control.
it,
And the people that I represent here in Delaware, they expected me to go down there and make friends on both sides of the aisle and get things done. And we were able to do that in a Congress that was incredibly partisan, where not very much got done.
Mr. Bonini, I think we have to address the presidential election that's going on right now.
Shocking.
And you were an early supporter.
Is there an election going on?
You were an early supporter of Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump, endorsing him at a Harrington rally in April. Since then, a lot has changed, including several allegations of sexual misconduct. Do you still support Mr. Trump for president? Why or why not?
So,
And sadly, you have 30 seconds.
the answer is yes. And first of all, what he said was unacceptable, period. By the way, we're both well, I'm a former athlete. He's probably still athletic. Spent a lot of time in locker rooms. It's just absolutely inappropriate. But the bottom line for me, regardless whether you like Donald Trump or not, was there are two core messages that I think are critical, and I think this country needs to talk about. One is that our government is broken in a lot of ways. And I think in Washington that's absolutely true. I think that's true less here in Delaware, but I think it's true, that our government is broken. And the second part is that the people in government are out of touch with the experiences of the average person. And I think both those things are very, very important.
I can give you 15 seconds if you would like.
I think Hillary Clinton would make a great president. I think we need a woman as president. That would be special, and that would be different. Hillary Clinton knows how to work across the aisle, notwithstanding all the animosity that she captured from the other side.
Well, now we're going to hear from the students in some of our online questions. And so that does conclude the first portion of this debate. Rapid fire that it was. Gentlemen, thank you for fielding those questions. In this section, you have 1 minute for an answer. So our first question comes from Lucas Surge, a senior studying mechanical engineering at the University of Delaware.
Marijuana possession has been decriminalized in the last couple of years. What's your stance on the subject?
Mr. Bonini, your response first, 1 minute.
So I actually favor legalization. And the reason I favor legalization is because we basically already have. We have decriminalized marijuana in Delaware, marijuana possession in Delaware to the point where it is de facto legal. My point is, if we're going to do it, let's do it all the way. Let's regulate it. Let's try to keep it out of the hands of kids. Let's regulate it. Let's enforce it so that we can, knock drug dealers out of business. The bottom line is, in Delaware, it is already de facto legal. By the way, I didn't agree with that policy, but that's the policy we have, and I think we need to be adults about it and understand that the message, the public policy decision on marijuana has been made. We should go ahead and do full legalization. And I think if we do that, we can keep it out of the hands of kids and, quite frankly, help reduce the drug trade.
Mr. Carney, 1 minute.
I don't support full legalization. I support the current status of decriminalization and our medical marijuana program. I would remind people that that program is not yet up and running. It seems to me before we take the step to recreational marijuana, we've got several states that are doing it right now. We ought to see what the experience is. One of my best friends in the Congress is a guy by the name of Ed Perlmutter, who's from Colorado. They're having some unintended consequences in Colorado with respect to their kind of being on the cutting edge with respect to that. I'd like to see our medical marijuana enterprise up and running before we do any change, and I'm really worried. I spent a week traveling up and down our state, talking to parents whose kids were addicted to heroin. And many of them talked about the pathway that their kids took from marijuana to other party drugs into heroin, and that really worries me as well.
May I follow up?
Actually, we need to move on to our next question so that we can hear from more of our students and from our online questioners, because we do have an online question, and this concerns cancer, and it comes from Cynthia Canavari, a volunteer with the American Cancer Society's Cancer Action Network. Cynthia asks, if elected, what other public policy priorities will you advance that will help prevent cancer, treat cancer, find cures for cancer, and improve the quality of life for cancer patients and survivors? Mr. Carney, your first 1 minute.
This is actually one of the areas where Delaware's had great success over the last 15 years or so since Ruth Ann Minter put in place the Cancer Consortium in the early 2000s. And I served on that committee. And we were able to reduce colorectal cancer mortality in our state and eliminate the difference between the African-American community and the total population in the screenings that determine that disease. Now, we need to address lung cancer, which is the #1 cancer killer in Delaware. We've got great medical leadership on that consortium. We need to fight for the funds to keep it running, and we need to make a commitment to really address cancer or lung cancer here in our state to really bring our numbers down. We used to be in the top 5 in cancer mortality. Now we're 13, 15, and dropping like a rock.
Mr. Bonini, 1 minute.
Yeah, so the bottom line is we do need more resources. And where do we get those resources? It goes back to the budgetary question. If we don't resolve our budgetary issues and our state spending, we're going to end up paying for just 2 things, state employee health care and Medicaid. So in order to free up resources for any of these, including cancer research, et cetera, I think absolutely we need to put more resources into that. We have to get our own financial house in order to free up those resources. So I realize that's not a specific question to cancer, but sort of a upper level question to say, hey, how are we going to get the resources? I think the other thing is, and what I'm proposing is, we need to have incentives for cutting edge research. And I'll tell you, at the University of Delaware, Delaware State University, those places, I'm proposing a fund to allow research funding for those researchers who can't quite qualify for NIH or NSF funding, but have promising research. And I actually think the state can play a significant role in that, and quite frankly, we can make significant progress, not just on cancer, but on other diseases as well.
James has a follow-up to the earlier student question.
Sure.
Mr. Carney, earlier you said you don't support legalizing recreational marijuana, but a survey by the University of Delaware Center for Political Communication found that 61% of Delawareans are in favor of making marijuana use legal in the state compared to only 35% opposed. Given the clear majority in favor, is that not a clear mandate?
Actually, Mr. Bonini is first on this response. Sorry about that. 1 minute.
Okay. Sorry, John. I'm going to step in. First of all, I'm a little suspicious of that poll. I think they actually polled dormitories here at the University of Delaware. So that same poll had Donald Trump losing Sussex County by close to 15 points.
That ain't going to happen.
That ain't going to happen. But I do think that there's a growing.
Actually, he was winning in Sussex County, according to our poll.
Okay, I apologize. Losing.
Just want to clarify the record.
Thank you,
for
but
the
it was
CPC.
Kent County. I apologize. Kent County losing by 10. That's not going to happen either. But the bottom line is, regardless of sort of the politics of it and the support, we've already made that decision. We have decriminalized it to the point where it's de facto legal. Up to 1 ounce of marijuana in Delaware is a traffic ticket. Oh, wait a minute. A traffic ticket is actually more expensive. Up to 6 ounces of marijuana in Delaware is an unclassified misdemeanor with probation before judgment. Translation, it's a traffic ticket. Regardless of you support it or not, that's the decision that we've already made, and we should live up to those decisions.
Mr. Carney, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I don't make all my decisions based on what the poll says. I think my approach is a smarter approach. I'm not saying that I wouldn't be for legalization at some point in the future. Let's find out what happens in Colorado and Washington and other states. Let's get our medical marijuana program up and running. Is public opinion an important part of any decision? Absolutely. We're elected to represent the people who elect us. So it's important to know. You won't stay elected long, by the way, if you ignore what the public opinion is. I just think there's a better way to do it here, and I'm very concerned about this heroin problem and the connection that might exist.
Actually, we need to keep moving, and I apologize for that, but we've walked out this topic.
You're going to let me in at some point. I'm going to.
We're going to turn now, though, to the issue of the death penalty, and we have this question that comes in from Landon Bailey, a senior political science major at Delaware State University.
Currently, due to a Supreme Court ruling, there is a moratorium on the death penalty being enforced in Delaware. As governor, will you sign legislation that reinstates the death penalty as an option?
Mr. Carney, 1 minute.
I would let the Supreme Court's decision stand, frankly. This is an issue that I've had a lot of time to think about. When I was lieutenant governor, I was chair of the Board of Pardons. I sat through 3 clemency hearings, each of which were convicted to die, and I did not vote to grant them, so that the governor would grant them clemency. What has concerned me as I've thought about this over the years, and I've thought about my position has evolved clearly, is that as there are 20% of our population, African Americans, which studies indicate that this is discriminatory against, and that they're more likely to be sentenced to death. To me, that's a big problem in terms of what's fair and what's just.
Mr. Bonini, 1 minute.
Yes, I would sign it.
Okay. We will now move on. Yes, did you have something you wanted to
as a
quickly?
follow-up, Mr. Carney, you said you would let the Supreme Court decision stand, but would you veto any bill that would make it to your desk?
I probably would. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to signal in advance whether you would veto a bill, but this is one of those gut check kind of issues. that you don't make a determination on based on what the polls might say. I think you have to think about what's right, what's fair, and what's just.
We're going to move on to another online question, and this comes from Patricia Risher. She asks, 76% of Delawareans say they prefer to remain in their own homes as they age, with assistance from a caregiver. So if you are elected, what policies will you promote to support Delawareans aging in place? Mr. Bonini, you are first on this for 1 minute.
Thank you. First of all, it's an excellent question. And it's not just a question of the personal situations that people face as their parents age, which I think most of us are going to face, but it's also a very significant public policy question because it is dramatically less expensive and more efficient and beneficial to the government programs to have people age in place if you can, as opposed to being put into an institution. So the bottom line is we need to do everything we can. I think a big part of it is education for caretakers. We took a very good first step. The ARP pushed a bill this last General Assembly. I think that needs to continue. I think we need to continue to work with providers for that education so that family members are educated and are given the tools to help keep folks at home who want to stay at home. And I also think we need to be looking at tax breaks if possible. I realize that people are going to say money's tight. Tax breaks if possible for those care providers.
Mr. Carney, 1 minute.
Yeah, I agree with Senator Bonini on this.
You heard that. Thank you. Once.
But again, it's not a simple issue. Financially, it's going to be very difficult to do. It is cheaper to do, but right now the government isn't paying for that. And so the question is, how do you develop a program where you're using existing funds that frankly are limited and we don't have money either at the federal level or at the state level for Medicare and Medicaid, which are responsible once you get into assisted care that pay these services. You're going to be adding costs, paying helping cover the cost for a family at home. We ought to look at every way to do it, but it's going to be hard to do.
I'm going to ask you a question that's going to have just a 30-second time limit because we're about to go into our closing statements. When Governor Markell was first elected in 2008, he reached across the aisle and named a Republican, Alan Levin, to his cabinet. Would you want to do the same? And if so, is there somebody that you already have in mind from across the aisle that you would like to see as a part of your administration? I'm limiting you both to 30 seconds, and I believe that the first person to answer this would be Mr. Bonini.
So the answer is absolutely. I've never, if I should admit this to my Republican colleagues, I've never voted a straight ticket in my life. In fact, there's some chance that I voted for somebody on this podium. I don't know. This thin, handsome guy pissed me off. But the answer is absolutely. And we have some great managers in our state government. We have some that I'm not thrilled about either, but absolutely. And I think if you look, I feel very strongly about what I believe in.
Do you have a name?
Sure, I would keep Jeff Bullock as Secretary of State if he'd work for me. I don't know if he would or not, but absolutely, I'd keep Jeff. I'd keep a variety of people. I don't want to name too many names. He's now lost his job in the Carney administration now, by the way.
Mr. Carney, who would you reach across the aisle to possibly name to your administration? And name names.
Well, I certainly would. I haven't thought much about it, much to the chagrin of some of my supporters and staff, because first things first. Now, I did a lot of coaching, including here at the University of Delaware, back in the early 80s, and the games that we lost were the ones that we took for granted. And so I'm not going to take anything for granted here in terms of the election. We'll think about that after November the 8th.
Gentlemen, that wraps up our questioning portion for this debate in the race for governor. You will each now have 1 minute for a closing statement. And we will begin with John Carney, who has the first closing statement. Mr. Carney.
Well, thank you very much for the sponsors and the University of Delaware. I see the new president of the University of Delaware here in the auditorium tonight with his lovely wife. Last year, I went to a UAW holiday party, and there was an old retired Chrysler worker there. Some of you have heard me tell this story. And he said to me, "Carney, I worked at Chrysler for 36 years, and it was a great job. I made a good salary, and I was able to support my family. And I learned one thing. When you have a good job, you keep it." Then he turned and looked me right in the eye, and he said, "What the hell are you doing running for governor?"
That's a good question.
I'm under no illusion that this job is going to be easy. In fact, I know that it's going to be really hard. But if you elect me governor, I will make those tough decisions. I won't forget who I work for. I will work hard every day. That's what I've tried to do for the 16 years that I've served when you first sent me to be Delaware's Lieutenant Governor. Thank you for your attendance tonight, and I look forward to your vote on November the 8th.
Mr. Bonini, your 1-minute closing statement.
So the first thing is, please vote for me. You should always ask. So I'm asking you to do something very hard. Change is hard. It's especially hard when your opponent is somebody that you respect and like, and that, quite frankly, the overwhelming majority of Delawareans respect and like. But 1 in 6 Delawareans is on food stamps, 1 in 4 Delawareans is on Medicaid, 1 in 5 children in Delaware growing up in poverty, 4 out of 5 of our public high school graduates are not ready for work or college. Change has to happen. And I'm asking people in Delaware to make a very difficult decision and say, you know what, we have to change course. And I honestly believe that I can lead Delaware in that change. And I know I've said this a bunch of times. John's a friend and a good guy and a smart guy, but I think Delaware needs to go in a different direction. And I want to say thank you for having me, and I'm kindly asking for your vote.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you very much for participating in this evening's University of Delaware Public Media debate. We appreciate it very much. I also want to thank our audience here at Mitchell Hall and our moderators for this section, Lindsay Hoffman and James Dawson. This will be wrapping up this debate for tonight with the candidates for Delaware Governor. We thank you for joining us as well. Good night.
Delaware Debates is a joint initiative of the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication and WDDE 91.1 FM Delaware Public Media, with support from AARP Delaware and from the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network and the William P. Frank Foundation of Delaware.